They are not published yet. I would be happy to share these preliminary ideas. Let me start. So I have changed slightly the title. So I will speak about like not only feminism itself, but in more broader perspective on women's so-called active citizenship. A little bit later, I will present my theoretical perspective. Let me start that Ukraine, especially since 2014, achieved significant progress on gender equality. It was promoted and pushed then in 2014, probably, as you know, the agreement on association between Ukraine and the EU was ratified. And of course, it led to some changes, political framework, including in the issue of gender equality. Here you can see at least some examples of these core achievements, and please like look at, for example, the law on gender equality or the equal rights or opportunities for women and men. It was implemented in Ukraine in 2005. So, and I would add to this list that we have rather strong women's NGO activism and feminist movement. And as a sociologist, I can claim that we are dealing with steady decline in the share of population who supports gender stereotypes and patriarchal gender roles. But despite, although we have this strong progress, Ukrainian legislation construct responsibilities related to military service differentially to citizens based on their gender. For those who are not aware on the context, in Ukraine, there is a mixed system of military formation operates, both professional and conscription. The professional army was and is open to women, but of course we had, you know, a strong progress on this issue. It was not so easy for women to get this access to professional army, but only civilian men, they were and are drafted into the army. Before the start of the full-scale war, a conscription army was rather a nominal norm because the vast majority of men, they passed military training, not in the army as such, but mostly at the educational institutions, like, for example, universities. But in the context of the full-scale war, the situation has changed dramatically. From a hypothetical expectations regarding male defenders of the state in peacetime, the very specific need for a mobilization appears because of the Russian invasion. Probably you know that since February 2022, the duty to defend the state is strictly constructed on the legislative level as a man's responsibility in the law and public discourse. Most men in Ukraine, they are prohibited from leaving the country. Of course, not all men serve, or not even majority. We have around 1 million people who are involved in defense sector. Mostly they are men. But of course, I get that you know this data, that there are 42,000 military women in Ukraine, and their number has increased more than 2 times in comparison with 2014, and 5,000 women are fighting on the front lines. Despite this huge progress, we still have this gender disparity that only civilian men, again, can be mobilized and drafted, while for civilian women, it's not an obligation but a right. My focus today is not military service or its gender dimension as such, but I start from this point that this new configuration of gender order, it's not the matter of only men or their military service, but this gender order also affects women and their rights. Just let me give you one example. If a man assigned by the state to protect the state during the war, it automatically leads that women, they are assigned to provide care work. And care work will be one of my focuses of today's talk. What about my theoretical perspective? There are different perspectives how citizenship is considered. It might be about right and obligations, practice and action, identity and sense of belonging. As you see, I rely in my talk on understanding citizenship as related to the set of rules governing the relationship between individuals and state and gendered relationships between individuals and the state. I'm also based on some feminist writing that develop alternative framework to consider how gender is built into citizenship regimes. And please be aware about limitations of my today's talk, because it's really hard to be a sociologist in terms of rapid changes, because any of my conclusion can become wrong. We do not know when the war will end, what share of population will be mobilized, where there will be any changes with conscription for women, and ultimately how social discourses and practices related to the war and mobilization will change. So I'm getting out of the situation for now. So citizenship during the war can be analyzed in different vectors. Like, for example, we can start from legal construction, right? How citizenship is constructed in rights and obligations. We can focus on discursive aspects, how citizenship is constructed, who are excluded and included. Just one very brief example of this possible vector of the analysis, the last Vladimir Zelensky addresses on the New Year Eve speech, when he stated that please, you have to make choose whether be a refugee or a citizen, or he claimed that during the war, either you should work or either you should fight, right? So symbolically, it's excluded from this category of citizenship. For example, those who are not employed, or excluded women refugees. But my focus today is mostly about action and practice of citizenship. And my question is, how the new regime of relationships between the state and the individuals affects the opportunities of women to realize their rights, in particular related to political participation in a broad sense, not just to be elected, right? But as an opportunity to influence, to have an impact on development of society and communities. And basically, if we start this discussion about challenges of the war for women's rights, we can find easily many of these, and there are at least some examples of risks of deepening the feminization of poverty, increasing the share of vulnerable groups of women, for example, single mothers who lost their partners at the war, increasing level of domestic violence, which is common picture for all war-torn societies, etc. But in my today's talk, I will concentrate on 3 dimensions because I consider them as interconnected. This is political rights of women as such, the challenges for the so-called care economy, which includes both paid and unpaid care work, or we call it reproductive work, and women's activism and its visibility and impact. So that's my plan for today. And let me start from political participation and representation of women, and what kind of challenges we can face during the war and after the war ends. If we look at the data, we can see that before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine has achieved significant progress in women's representations in government bodies, particularly in elected ones. Here you can see that in the parliament, in regional councils and city councils, we have the increasing significantly the share of women, not least thanks to the mechanisms of gender quota in party list that was implemented in Ukraine in 2015. What is happening in the context of war? What we know from data in reports? First of all, we should distinguish at the informal community level, people's participation in decision-making and management of resources has increased due to the active self-organization's effort of volunteers and civil society. And this is, of course, is especially true for women who lead and manage the majority of humanitarian responses and volunteer groups. However, if we look at the formal decision-making processes, it's obvious that it has become more difficult for women to influence this decision because of the centralization of power and the increased role of the military administration in wartime decision. Just probably one example from so-called regional state military administrations. The head of these administrations are not elected. They are assigned by the president. And if we look at the data, out of 24 regional military administrations of Ukraine, only one is headed by a woman. At the same time, we have some data from surveys that people in Ukraine, they would like to see a better balance between men and women in political life. What kind of, expectations I have on this situation in the future? Of course, it's not a new concept that I would like to use to describe these possible expectations, so-called hierarchization of citizenship. That means that those who fought or fight or made other visible contributions to the defense of the state, and these, as we know from data, are mostly men, will have a stronger position in the society, while the demands of other women and other groups who did not make this explicit contribution to the victory might be subordinated. And it's not only about women, it might be also about, for example, people with disability. And if you look, for example, the data of representative survey of June 2023, 46 of Ukrainians believe that the military and veterans will contribute most to the effective development of Ukrainian society in the future. And these, trends have a real and not symbolic impact on women's rights even now. For example, on protection from violence. We have already have some evidences that, for example, a woman who suffers from partner violence at the hands of military man, and she apply complaints to the police and can hear something like, "He's protecting us, but you complain to him," because of this prioritization of voices of those who are military. But I have some more or less optimistic expectations, taking into account that we have gender quota law. It means that this law will prevent the formal level of representation of women in elected bodies from decreasing, right? So anyway, we will have a certain share of women elected during the first after-war elections or during the war elections, because we don't know when these elections will be conducted. So we do not know actually what will happen and when this election will happen, but yes, of course, the war affects on the configuration of political forces, and I can assume that, like, I don't know, experiences of people who are volunteers or who are serve in military service, they will be instrumentalized by political elites, of course. Yes, and one additional thread, trying to follow attentively the public discourse and different initiatives. This is an indirect narrowing of women's rights in the political sphere is possible as well. For example, the introduction of a requirement to have military training for opportunities to work in public sector, in public service sector. This idea was expressed at the very end of the full-scale war by one of the former ministers of defense. It was an initiative, not a bill or law draft, but these kind of initiatives may lead to decrease in the share of women among civil servants because they are much less likely to undergo military training. So we have to be very cautious on these discourses initiatives. Yeah. Let me move to my second part related to care work, and I would like to stress that political participation and activism and care work, they are interconnected, because increasing women's burden of reproductive or care work threatens women's ability to realize other key civic rights, for example, decent work and employment, as well as political and civic participation. Let me remind you that care work consists of paid and unpaid care work and services that support caregiving in all its forms. I would say for the beginning that Ukraine is characterized by the so-called gender contract of the working mother. It means that the high level of female employment was associated with predominantly females' responsibility for care work. Although, of course, with a certain but slow positive dynamics in the level of attitudes and some practices on distribution of this work in families. Just let me present you briefly some data from pre-war period. Not so optimistic, right? Because here we can see the vast majority of Ukrainians, they believe that women has to take care of the home and family, and the majority of Ukrainians believe that the main man's role is to be so-called breadwinner. If we look at the data that we got after the full-scale war started, it's interestingly that we have the positive trend on decreasing of those people who suppose that men are better leaders than women. It's decreased sufficiently for 2 years of this survey. It's interesting that the second statement that you can see, the main theme, a woman's vocation is to give birth to children, it also decreased, but not so significantly, right? So we have much more progress related to women's role and so-called public sphere, but not on women's role in private sphere. What we have, what kind of challenges we are dealing with during the war? Yeah. Sorry, I have forgotten a couple of additional data. about the practices of distribution of care responsibilities in Ukrainian family. And here we can see that it's not so equal as we would like to have it. So what about care work or reproductive work? Here you can see some heartbreaking photos, pictures with mothers who continue to support their kids and to provide care under so dramatic situations, like helping with homeworks and bomb shelters. And in the right part of the slide, you see a picture of a mom who celebrates birthday of her kid in metro station during air raid alarms. Why the burden on women on reproductive work increased? There are some reasons. First of all, many of Ukrainian families, they are separated. They're forcibly separated by displacement, right? Those who internally displaced or those who are refugees who left Ukraine. So, and mostly women, they can't rely on the usual support on realizing this care work. They can't rely on their partners for some other reasons, like, for example, a partner might be at the front line, right? Or so a lot of things, or other very important factor, this is reducing care resources and infrastructure. Like, for example, if you look at the data, we see that in many regions, kindergartens, they don't operate properly still because of security reasons, because the bomb shelters are not equipped appropriately, right? And that's why local government, they would prefer do not open these facilities. But from gender studies, we know that childcare services and kindergarten, they are a very important factor of gender equality, because if there is no available childcare services, mostly a mother who stays at home and she can't be employed, and it will affect negatively on gender pay gap and her career opportunities, etc. What is going on with fatherhood or fathering practices? It's very interesting, and I was pretty much surprised when I found this data, how the war affected on fathering practices. Let's look at the data that we have. First of all, before the war started, Ukraine has made great progress in promoting the new model of caring masculinity, right? Here you can see some very nice pictures that good dad is not a wallet. He can feed his baby, or he can play, etc. What is going on now? It's interestingly because we got a data. It was the research agency InfoSapiens representative survey conducted in 2023. And it was found the participation of fathers in caring for kids has increased since the war started. And can you see that the share of men who would like to take part on parental leave has increased as well from 20 to 50%. That is absolutely amazing from sociological point of view. Let me explain my assumption like what I assume, why it's happening. Well, the methodology of this research was that it was not the quantitative measurement of how many hours fathers they in fact spent with their kids. It was their subjective estimations, right? So their kind of how they estimated by themselves, did this time increased or decreased? And they said that it has increased. It's my understanding, or my very cautious or careful assumption, that it's not about mostly kind of the objective changes, but it's more about existential things, because during the war and during any kind of humanitarian and other types of disaster, the value of of a family, right? The value of care and love has a significantly higher role. So that's why probably fathers, they just would like to spend more time with their kids. But of course, if you look at the InfoSapiens research agency website, you can find more data on this research, and it's really interesting. But what kind of threats I feel? I'm wondering that on the one hand, we have made a great progress in promoting this new caring type of masculinity, right? In promoting, for example, the role of fathers in childcare. We saw many examples in media of fathers who took parental leaves, right? But now, following, I did not make an analysis, but following the, I don't know, media space or social advertisement space, I see that we are dealing with new role model of a father who is soldier, right? So, and this might be a little bit challenging for following our progress into this issue of so-called caring masculinity. I don't know the data, but it's kind of my assumption of this transformation. And the second thing that is super challenging, I would say that we can expect that in the context of war, when Muslim men are mobilized, and in the context of fact that the state has still a weak system of rehabilitation of wounded soldiers and veterans, it's only like women actually will compensate the lack of these state programs by their care and reproductive work and supporting their partners, husbands, and sons. And here you can see the print screen from the media material, which is entitled, "Thanks to his wife, he takes the first steps." And this is very challenging. Just 2 days ago, I have seen one great report on this topic was published. Sorry, I was not able to read it carefully, but it is very challenging because, definitely we will have many wounded veterans and soldiers, and mainly women. They will provide the most part of care work for their rehabilitation. One thing that is related to care economy is care jobs. So paid care work, care jobs. And here we are dealing with many challenges as well. We know from data that the war significantly increased the burden on so-called female jobs, like kindergarten educators, nurses, social workers, again, the background of increased workload and reduction in their salaries and funding. And we know that so-called female jobs are key in overcoming humanitarian challenges of war, and mostly women who perform this job, they compensate the weakness of state policies in the field of education, medicine, healthcare, social protection. Here you can see the heartbreaking picture of a teacher who during electricity the absence of electricity, he tried to connect to Wi-Fi somewhere near the supermarket to conduct the online lessons for her students. And I'm afraid that this situation of women who are employed in these very important spheres, it will be very challenging, because these areas will be the first to suffer from neoliberal reforms of the war and post-war recovery period. And I'm moving to the last part of my presentation, which is related to women's activism, and including feminist movement. If we look briefly at what kind of, during the war, actually, peaceful protests, they are mostly prohibited, or they are sufficiently limited. That's why women, for example, they can't organize a feminist march, which is very, very popular in Ukraine. We soon have this date of the 8th of March, which is International Day of Women's Rights. So now there is no possibility to conduct these big events. What kind of examples of explicit examples of women's activism we are dealing now? I'm just looked at some recent cases. The most popular, I would say, I did not make research on this, but it's obviously for me that the most popular is widespread the actions of women for the demobilization of the military. So mostly it's about women whose partners are on front line and they demand to provide a recovery for their partners, right, to be demobilized. So it's very popular, and from time to time, it appears in many cities of Ukraine. Other forms are not so widespread, but I have found one interesting related to care economy issue. It was in Kremen, city of Kremenchuk, it's my native region, Poltava region, when mothers, they came to a city mayor with a demand to open kindergartens because they did not operate appropriately because of the war challenges, and they asked to open the kindergartens. I think, what about the feminist movement or feminist activism? What I think that the position of feminist movement in the context of war is surrounded by a complex and very contradictory discourses. First of all, I would say that feminism is rather popular in Ukraine, especially, it's my assumption, among young, well-educated women and girls. What kind of challenges I consider as relevant in the future of feminism in the context of war and post-war recovery? Well, I would here distinguish two dimensions, two challenges. The first one, this is kind of a political position at itself in interaction with authorities and the impact of feminist movement on political decisions. Here, I would say the position of feminism is rather strong because of different reasons. First of all, this is, of course, the demands, requirements of accession to the European Union, or demands of international donors to include the agenda of gender equality in post-war developmental plans. And one of the examples why I think so, and definitely gender scholars, they are aware that the so-called Istanbul Convention against all form of violence against women, was ratified by Ukraine in June 2022, right? After more than 11 years of active advocacy campaigns of women's movement with a demand to ratify this convention. It was not ratified till June 2022 because of the strong resistance of so-called conservative or religious or pro-religious groups. Let's label it so-called anti-gender initiatives, in the meaning anti-gender equality initiatives. And then it was pretty much a surprise because nobody expected this, but the convention was ratified because of the political willingness, because that time Ukraine was waiting to get in a status as a candidate for the European Union accession. And of course, I understand that I don't have any illusion that, what I mean, that of course I can assume that the topic of Istanbul Convention was instrumentalized, was just used by the government to show the loyalty, right, of Ukrainian government to European values. But anyway, it provides a good advocacy instrument for women's organization. What about public impact? Here so what I mean, it's interaction of feminism or feminist with public, with society. Here I would say that this position is rather weak. First of all, why I think so? Because the problems of gender equality are perceived by society as so-called out of date. Of course, it's not a new story for Ukrainian feminism, but it has become more acute in the war situation. I mean that people, they suppose that, of course, we have more urgent issues, but not, women's rights. Then it's about public positioning of the demands of the women's movement. For example, the demands of protecting women from violence in the context of war, and, for example, demands of mothers and wives of military who demand rotation for them, or the rights of veterans to be treated with dignity, which of course are important. But these two types of women's demand, they might have different public support. What I mean that, of course, the image of mother waiting for her son from the war will always be stronger during the war than the image of a feminist who stands up for her rights. The second reason that, in my opinion, can reduce public legitimization of feminism demands and the communication of the feminist issues with society is that women's rights, unlike men's rights, are not explicitly restricted during the war. And I assume that this will be a point, if not a criticism, but at least a certain tension. And I have already noted that heroization of military can have specific negative consequences for women's rights, for example, from protection from domestic violence. Another sensitive topic is, for example, the criticism of the armed forces of Ukraine, for example, regarding manifestation of sexism and sexual harassment, which can be perceived sometimes in public discourse as playing into the hands of Russian propaganda because it discredits the Ukrainian army. But I would finish my presentation more or less positive topic, and I would say that there is one, I would say, very strong argument to support feminism during the war in Ukraine, which might be useful for both political and public positioning of feminism. This is political context related to the war against Ukraine. Because this war, as we know, is closely related to Ukrainian society's desire for European integration. Of course, I do not see EU integration as a magic event that will bring rapid change. However, this process most likely will be a strong safeguard against a possible so-called conservative backlash or rollback in gender equality and the direct restrictions of women's rights. For example, abortion bans. I don't expect these direct restrictions, but of course we should be very cautious and careful following different initiatives. So what I mean that this is very strong argument that human rights and gender equality and LGBT rights movements, that we promote those values that are in contrast to the ideology of so-called Ruski Mir related to homophobia, decriminalization of domestic violence, and human rights violation. And linking movements against gender equality with Russian narratives can delegitimize, at least to some extent, the position of so-called anti-gender movement and its influence on decision-making in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your kind attention. You can contact me if you have any questions, or you can contact me via Facebook or my email. And I'm looking forward hearing your questions and ideas. Thank you.